Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Ushanka Show, stories about life in the Soviet Union. So I already made a couple of videos on the topic of Russification and using Russian language as a tool to turn Ukrainian people into Soviet people. And if by any chance you missed those videos, links will be below in the comment section. Okay, so I just realized that I forgot to mention about one important moment. There was a resistance against Russification in Ukraine, and it happened mostly among the Ukrainian intelligentsia, so professors, teachers, journalists, poets, and some students. An interesting example of such a resistance was Ivan Dzyuba, who was born in July of 1931 in Mikhailivka, Donbas region of Ukraine, and he died on February 22nd, 2022, just a couple of days before Russia attacked Ukraine. And he was a Ukrainian literary critic and social activist and dissident. In 1965, he wrote a book, Internationalism or Russification, Internationalism або Russificatia, where he analyzed from the Marxist position the national and cultural policy of the Soviet Union in Ukraine. Besides that, he sent his book to the first secretary of Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine, Petro Shelest, as well as the head of Ukrainian government, Vladimir Sherbitsky. He also translated his book into Russian language and sent it to Moscow as well. In his book, and it has like 285 pages, Ivan Dzyuba quoted Marx, Engels, Lenin to show that the current policies of the Communist Party in Ukraine, by choking Ukrainian language and culture and promoting Russian language and culture, contradicts to Marxism-Leninism. By the way, if you're interested in this topic, I will provide the link to this book in the comment section so you can read to yourself. It's quite an interesting read, although it's 285. So of course, when the communist leaders in Kiev and Moscow read this book, it sent a shockwave across the whole country, because our leadership realized what a huge mistake they did with their current policies. And they were like, oh my God, they were like, oh my Lenin, we are so sorry. Just kidding. Reaction of the Soviet government declared Internationalism or Russification book to be anti-Soviet work, and its distribution, storage, and even just reading to be a crime. Ivan Dzyuba lost his job, he was expelled from the Writers' Union of Ukraine, and faced harassment from the KGB. And finally, in 1972, he was jailed for 18 months. Some critics stated that it was quite naive for Ivan Dzyuba to hope that using Vladimir Lenin's own words, and especially one of his most important and famous books is like a Bolshevik's Bible, The Right of Nations to Self-Determination, that somehow would help him to promote the cause of protecting Ukrainian language and Ukrainian culture from Russification. Like, look at this beautiful quote. As Lenin said, if a great Russian communist insists upon the amalgamation, don't know what that word means, of the Ukraine with Russia, Ukrainians might easily suspect him of advocating this policy not from the motive of uniting the proletarians in the fight against capital, but because of the prejudices of old great Russian nationalism, of imperialism. So that's a quote. For Lenin, there was one criterion of internationalist sincerity in this question: the recognition or non-recognition of the Ukraine's unconditional right to total separation, to full national independence. Lenin recognized this right without reservation, blah, 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 blah. The English language has this beautiful idiom, to pay lip service, which means to give a false or insincere declaration that one supposedly values, supports, respects, or believes in something. And Ivan Dzyuba exposed absolute hypocrisy of the communist regime, because their Bible, their Soviet Jesus, Vladimir Lenin, was saying one thing and they were doing totally opposite thing. But when Ivan Dzyuba pointed to the Lenin's book, The Right of the Nations to Self-Determination, which is kind of like a part of nationalism, the reply was, silly rabbit, nationalism is for the capitalist countries. It's a useful tool to destroy them. But when it comes to socialist countries, Nationalism is bad. And I remember the interview of Leonid Kravchuk, who became the first president of independent Ukraine, and before that he was the top dog of the Communist Party of Ukraine, sharing the story that they were not allowed to say nationalism when they came to nationalism in Soviet Ukraine. The official title was bourgeois nationalism, bourgeoisный nationalism. And that terminology was coined by Lenin in his book, The Right of Nations for Self-Determination. Lenin was totally cool with nationalism movement in capitalist countries, but if it happened in socialist country, you must name it bourgeois nationalism, and it's a bad thing. Close to 20 Ukrainian intellectuals who resisted Russification of Ukraine end up in prison or labor camps. Among them, Vasyl Stus, who was Ukrainian poet, translator, and journalist. After being arrested, he ended up in, they call it ITL, Исправительно-трудовая колония, so it's like re-education labor camp, Perm 36, when he passed away on September 4, 1985, right around the time when perestroika had begun. Another famous Ukrainian politician and Soviet dissident was Vyacheslav Chornovil. He was arrested multiple times in 1960s and 1970s and 1980s, and he actually ran to be a president of Ukraine back in 1999, and he died in a really bizarre car accident on March 25, 1999, in age 61. And that car accident is still not solved. But let's go back to the topic of Russification in Ukraine. Some of you may remember this graph I showed in my previous video. So this is how Russian language in red was replaced in Ukrainian language in blue in Ukrainian schools. So around 1985, that's when pretty much was 50-50, and then Russian language was more popular as the main language, like you teach subjects in Ukrainian schools. So in order to speed up the Russification of Ukraine, in November of 1978, the Ministry of Education of Ukraine issued new directive, new order to improve learning Russian language in Ukrainian schools. And at that time, they offered bonus 16 to 25% to teachers that switch from teaching their subject from in Ukrainian language into Russian language. So for example, if you're a teacher of math and you were teaching it in Ukrainian, you will get additional bonus like 25% to your salary if you start teaching math in Russian. What I find interesting that this Russian bonus was introduced 1 year after so-called Brezhnev Constitution was adopted. And that constitution was adopted on October 7, 1977 by the Supreme Soviet, and it replaced a so-called Stalin Constitution of 1936. Among other things, this constitution stated that the USSR became a developed socialist society and that Soviet Union now is a national state of the Soviet people. So Советский народ, Soviet people were for the very first time mentioned officially in the constitution. But Ukraine still wasn't becoming Russian fast enough, so in 1983 there was another order to improve teaching of Russian language in Ukraine, and now they offered 15% bonus for the teachers in the first, second, and third grade, which in America they call elementary school. So if you switch teaching the kids from Ukrainian to Russian, you get 15% bonus. I also found this interesting stats. This is from 1988, and it's called Russification of the theaters in the Soviet Union. So this is the amount of theaters in the different republics and how many of them used a national language. In Belarus, 17 theaters and only 3 were using Belarusian language. Kazakhstan, Kazakhskaya Soviet Socialist Republic, 36 theaters, only 10. Ukraine, out of 113 theaters, only 38. Then you got Latvia, out of 9, 4. Georgia went pretty strong. Out of 33 theaters, 26 were in Georgian, using Georgian language. Armenia, out of 2018, really strong. And Litovskaya, so Lithuania, out of 12 theaters, 11 were in national language. So you could tell which republic suffered the most from Russification. Number 1, Belarus. Number 2, Kazakhstan, and number 3, Ukraine. And before we wrap up, let's go through some of your comments. Quite a few people replied to my statement that one day global language will be English. Like this comment right here: why would global language be English? Most people on the planet speak Chinese or Hindu. Only 1 in 7 speak English. I believe even right now the most popular widespread language in the world is English with accent. If you speak Russian, you are Russian. It's coming from Evgeny Uskov. Looking at his name, definitely he is Russian. No, not really. For example, I never consider myself Russian, even though I always spoke Russian. I consider myself Soviet of Ukrainian descent. This is a classic example of so-called Russian chauvinism. If you speak Russian, you are Russian. Wrong. Next one. Do your children understand Russian or Ukrainian? Unfortunately not. Neither of my kids speak neither language, just English. I tried with my daughter when she was born in 2000, but it's quite challenging when your wife is an American and speaks only English and you speak only Russian. So I tried, but unfortunately I failed, so none of my kids speak Russian or Ukrainian. Russians were already there, so he's probably talking about Donbas area and Crimea. Both of those areas were considered Russian land by who? By Kremlin. Even during the days of the empire, Russia gave those places to Ukraine. So generous of Russia to help them be economically viable, because otherwise all Ukraine had was Kiev and Odessa, with the entire rest of the country being farms. Well, Donbas area was actually developed in mid-late 1800s when iron and coal was discovered, and before there was just, there was Ukrainian farms. So just because you discovered iron and coal, and since you needed more labor, you brought a bunch of Russians from Russia, it doesn't make your the territory Russian. It was still Ukraine. This comment relates to my name, Sergey. You can always change your name to the Italy, Spain spelling Sergio or Sergio. In case of Spain, the ladies will go crazy. I have quite a few of my coworkers that just call me Serge. It's kind of more like French spelling, but yeah, I use CJ quite extensively because it makes it easy to spell. And here's the interesting comment about situation in Latvia with languages. I'm an American born and raised in America with no Eastern European roots. I live in Latvia now. Yeah, it's the same situation here. The government finally, after 30 years of independence, decided to stop using taxpayers' money to run lush Russian language only schools in Latvia. And Russians are crying, genocide, save us Putin. Imagine that. So yeah, it's interesting. Like in America, all the schools are English language, right? And if you want to have private school, you can have a Spanish school, Vietnamese language, Chinese, whatever. But the main schools that are paid by taxpayers, it's English language. So it's pretty much standard. But Russians, there's something about many of them, not all of them, but many, that they moved to different republic at that time. Now it's a different country, but they think they still can just have to have their schools in Russian. They have to have their stores in Russian. Like, if you like your Russian language so much, move back to Russia. All right, so I think it's all I have for you today. If you like this video, please don't forget to like it. You can also subscribe. Otherwise, we'll talk to you soon. До побачення. Goodbye.